Winter 1944. Snow covers the forests and fields of Belgium and Luxembourg. The bitter cold bites through worn German uniforms as soldiers march west. Their boots crunch on frozen ground. They are tired, hungry, and low on supplies. The German army has launched a surprise offensive. It is known as the Battle of the Bulge. The goal is to split Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. German commanders hope a sudden strike will turn the tide of the war. American units are spread thin along the front. Many believe the war is almost over. They are unprepared for the sudden German attack. In the chaos, some American positions are overrun. Others are forced to surrender. German troops move quickly through small towns and forest roads, seizing weapons, vehicles, and whatever supplies they can find. At a captured American outpost, a group of German soldiers searches through wooden crates stacked against a snow-covered wall. They expect to find ammunition or field gear. Instead, one soldier pulls out a small, colorful package. It is a pack of chewing gum. Another opens a box and finds chocolate bars wrapped in shiny foil. There are tins of meat, packets of coffee, sugar, and even cigarettes neatly packed inside. The Germans are stunned. These are American rations, designed to keep a soldier strong in harsh conditions. Each kit, known as a K-ration, contains a full day's worth of food. The chocolate is rich and high in calories. The gum keeps a soldier's mouth moist on long marches. Coffee provides warmth and alertness during cold nights. Even the packaging is carefully made to protect the food from rain and snow. The German soldiers glance at one another in disbelief. They open more boxes and find the same items again and again. For them, this is almost unthinkable. German rations at this stage of the war are meager. A typical day's food is a piece of dark bread, some thin soup, and a small slice of sausage or cheese. Ersatz coffee, made from roasted barley or chicory, is a poor substitute for the real thing. Many units have not received full supplies for weeks. Hunger is constant. One German private tears open a chocolate bar and eats it slowly, savoring the rich taste. Another tucks a pack of gum into his pocket as if it were treasure. Their sergeant shakes his head and mutters that the Americans fight a different kind of war. In their minds, these small luxuries reveal something larger. If the United States can send gum, candy, and coffee all the way to the front lines, their factories and supply chains must be vast. It is a sign of power. Nearby, captured American soldiers sit in the snow under guard. They watch their captors handle the rations with amazement. Some of the Americans feel uneasy. These are everyday items to them, things they take for granted. Now, they realize how unusual they seem to the enemy. A young American corporal looks down at his empty hands, embarrassed. The Germans are not only better supplied but also reminded of what they lack. For the German army, the disparity in supplies is not just about comfort. It affects combat readiness. Well-fed soldiers have more energy to fight and recover from wounds. Proper rations prevent disease and exhaustion. The German High Command knows this, but Allied bombing has disrupted rail lines and warehouses. Fuel shortages cripple truck convoys. Even when food is available, it often cannot reach frontline units in time. As the battle rages, these differences become clear. American troops can dig in and defend positions with steady supplies of food and ammunition. They rotate units to rest and recover. Germans, by contrast, march on empty stomachs, relying on captured supplies to keep going. Every tin of meat, every chocolate bar seized from American stockpiles becomes part of their survival. On one frigid morning, a German officer holds up a pack of chewing gum during a field briefing. His men crowd around, staring. He asks aloud why the Americans receive such things while they go without. There is no answer. The silence is heavy. Some soldiers laugh bitterly. Others grow quiet, thinking of families back home facing hunger under Allied bombing campaigns. This small moment has a deep effect. It drives home the reality of the war. The Germans are fighting not just soldiers, but an industrial giant. The enemy has resources beyond imagination. The Americans can afford to treat their troops with care, providing comforts even in battle. The Germans must ration every bullet and every loaf of bread. In the days that follow, word spreads through the German units. Stories circulate about the amazing contents of American ration boxes. Some tales are exaggerated, but the truth is enough. Soldiers talk about coffee that smells rich and strong, about candy wrapped in bright paper, about cigarettes better than any they have smoked before. The Battle of the Bulge continues with fierce fighting in the forests and villages. Snow falls heavier each day, covering foxholes and tanks alike. German forces push hard at first, but soon their advance slows. Fuel runs low. Ammunition dwindles. Food grows scarcer. Meanwhile, American reinforcements arrive with fresh supplies and new weapons. For the men at the front, the contrast remains vivid. In a frozen field, a German soldier chews a piece of American gum, thinking about what it means. A captured ration is more than food. It is proof of the enemy's strength and a reminder of the hardships they face. The gum loses its flavor quickly, but the memory stays. In 1944, the U.S. Army had developed a system of rations designed to keep its soldiers healthy and ready for combat. These rations were not just food. They were carefully planned tools of war. Each box contained a full day's supply of calories, packed with the right balance of protein, fat, and carbohydrates. American commanders knew a soldier who was well-fed would fight longer and recover faster. The most common field ration was the K-ration. It came in 3 small boxes, one for breakfast, one for lunch, and one for dinner. Each meal was sealed inside a wax-coated carton that kept out moisture and dirt. Inside, there were items that seemed simple but were vital. There was canned meat like Spam or chopped ham, crackers, and biscuits. Sugar, salt, and powdered drinks were included. Each meal had a small pack of cigarettes, a book of matches, and sometimes even toilet paper. There was always something sweet like candy or chewing gum. These small comforts were more than just calories. They kept morale high during long days in the field. The D-ration was different. It was a compact chocolate bar, dense with calories. It was made to survive heat and rough handling. Soldiers carried it as an emergency food source. It was not meant to taste good. In fact, it was intentionally made to be hard to chew so that soldiers would only eat it when absolutely necessary. A single D-ration could keep a soldier alive for a day if no other food was available. Even the packaging showed how advanced American logistics had become. The cartons were coated in wax to resist rain and snow. The cans were sealed tight to prevent spoilage. The labels were clear and easy to read, even in low light. Every detail was designed to ensure the food could reach a soldier fresh and safe, no matter where he was stationed. This level of planning required enormous industrial effort. Entire factories were devoted to producing rations by the millions. Trains, trucks, and ships moved them across oceans and continents. The flow of supplies never stopped. On the German side, the situation was very different. At the start of the war, German rations were adequate. Soldiers received hearty bread, meat, cheese, and coffee. But by late 1944, years of fighting and constant Allied bombing had drained the system. Supply trains were destroyed before they reached the front. Fuel shortages meant trucks could not deliver food on time. German factories struggled to keep up with demand. As a result, frontline soldiers often went hungry. Their daily ration was a small piece of dark bread, some thin cabbage soup, and a bit of sausage or cheese if they were lucky. Meat was rare. Butter was replaced by margarine or not given at all. Instead of coffee, soldiers drank ersatz coffee made from roasted barley or chicory. It had none of the energy or warmth of real coffee. In some units, men survived by foraging or taking food from nearby villages. Hunger was constant and exhausting. The difference between the two armies was stark. An American soldier might have 3 meals a day with a variety of foods, while a German soldier went days without proper nutrition. This affected more than morale. It affected combat performance. A hungry soldier tires quickly. His aim suffers. His body becomes more vulnerable to illness and cold. The abundance of U.S. rations reflected something larger than just food. It was proof of America's industrial strength. The United States had factories that ran around the clock. They produced not just weapons and vehicles, but also the basic supplies that kept armies moving. The network that delivered these rations was vast. Supplies left American ports on massive cargo ships. They arrived in England, France, and other Allied territories, then moved forward by rail and truck to the front lines. Even as battles raged, the supply lines stayed open. German soldiers saw this difference firsthand when they captured American positions. They found stockpiles of food that seemed luxurious compared to their own meager rations. Chocolate bars, chewing gum, and tins of meat were things they had not seen in years. For many, it was a shock. These items were small, but they revealed the scale of resources the Americans had at their command. One German soldier might find a box of instant coffee and wonder how many more boxes lay behind it, stretching back to the factories in the United States. Another might see a crate of canned meat and realize that for everyone he saw, there were thousands more already on their way to the front. The sight of these supplies could be demoralizing. It reminded them that they were not only fighting men but also an enemy machine far larger than themselves. For the Americans, these rations were routine. Soldiers opened their K-rations without much thought, often trading items they did not like with one another. Gum was chewed during long marches to keep mouths moist and spirits up. Coffee was boiled over small stoves in foxholes. Cigarettes were shared during brief moments of rest. These rituals gave the food meaning beyond nutrition. They were a part of daily life, a thread of normalcy in the chaos of war. The contrast between the two armies was clear in every box of rations. On one side, abundance and careful planning. On the other, scarcity and improvisation. As the war dragged on, this difference grew wider. American soldiers marched forward with full stomachs and steady supplies. German soldiers fell back, hungry and weakened, fighting not just the enemy but also the crushing weight of starvation and dwindling resources. The discovery of gum and candy in American rations was more than a moment of surprise. It was a glimpse into the deeper reality of the war. It showed how much the United States could give its soldiers and how little Germany could provide its own. The simple contents of a wax-coated box told a story of factories, ships, trains, and an industrial system that never stopped working. It was a story that played out on every battlefield, meal by meal until the very end. The forest was silent except for the crunch of boots in the snow. German soldiers moved through the trees, their rifles ready, their faces pale from cold and exhaustion. The attack had been sudden and violent. American lines had broken in several places. The Germans pushed forward, seizing ground before the enemy could regroup. They needed fuel, ammunition, and food. Every unit had orders to take whatever they could find. Smoke drifted from the remains of a small American position. Tents were torn, and scattered gear lay half-buried in the snow. A knocked-out jeep sat on its side, its tires burned away. The German squad moved incautiously. They expected a fight or an ambush, but the only sounds were the groans of a few wounded men and the wind whistling through the pines. The squad leader signaled to begin searching. Two men pried open ammunition crates while another checked for maps or coded messages. These were the things they needed most. A young soldier flipped open a wooden box and froze. Inside were neat rows of small waxed cartons. Curious, he pulled one out. It was light, no heavier than a handful of bread. The label read, "Breakfast Unit." He tore it open and stared. Inside were crackers, a tin of ham and eggs, a packet of sugar, and a small bar of chocolate wrapped in shiny foil. In one corner of the box was a small green pack with strange white sticks inside. He had never seen anything like it. Another soldier leaned over his shoulder and whispered, "Was this das?" The young man shrugged, tearing open the green pack and pulling out a piece. It was gum. Word spread quickly through the squad. Men abandoned their search for documents and ammunition and began tearing open the other boxes. They found coffee packets, salt tablets, and small packs of cigarettes, each with its own book of matches. One man let out a low laugh when he found a tiny square of toilet paper folded neatly inside a wrapper. For men who had been living on thin soup and hard bread, this was astonishing. The squad leader stepped into the center of the group, holding up a chocolate bar. "This is what they eat on the front line?" His tone was sharp, almost angry. "They send this to their soldiers while we march hungry?" The others muttered in disbelief. Some stared at the items in their hands as if they could not be real. One older soldier shook his head and said, "Back home, our families stand in line for bread, and here they hand out candy." Nearby, a group of captured Americans sat in the snow, guarded by two Germans with rifles. They watched silently as their captors examined the rations. The scene was strange and uncomfortable. To the Americans, these were normal supplies. Every soldier carried gum and chocolate in his pack. Now they saw their enemy treating these things like treasures. A German officer arrived, his coat buttoned tight against the cold. He moved slowly through the camp, taking in the scene. He picked up a pack of chewing gum, turning it over in his gloved hand. He looked at the prisoners and then at his men. "They send this to the front lines?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. None of the prisoners answered. The officer shook his head and tossed the gum back into the snow. The discovery shifted the mood in the camp. At first, there had been excitement. Now there was a heavier feeling. The Germans realized what this meant. The Americans had so much food and so many supplies that they could afford to send luxuries like gum and candy into battle. If they had this much to spare, their overall resources must be enormous. As night fell, a fire was built from broken crates and scraps of wood. The Germans brewed captured coffee in a battered tin pot. The rich smell filled the cold air. Some sipped cautiously, savoring the taste. Others chewed gum for the first time, testing its strange texture. A few traded pieces of candy with each other like valuable currency. The prisoners sat apart, watching their captors enjoy the simple items they had taken for granted. Later, a German soldier approached the prisoners. He held out a cigarette in one hand and a piece of chocolate in the other. In halting English, he offered a trade, more chocolate for information about nearby supply depots. The American sergeant shook his head, refusing. The German cursed softly and walked away, pocketing the cigarette. The next morning, the squad moved on. They loaded as many captured rations as they could carry. The coffee, gum, and candy were tucked into packs alongside rifles and grenades. As they marched, the men spoke in low voices about what they had seen. Some were bitter, blaming their own leaders for the shortages. Others were simply quiet, lost in thought. Behind them, the captured Americans were marched to the rear. One young prisoner glanced back at the abandoned camp. He saw a piece of green gum wrapper fluttering in the wind. It seemed like a small thing, but he understood its meaning. To the Germans, it was a sign of how unequal this war had become. The advance slowed as the days passed. Snow fell heavier, covering the tracks of men and vehicles. German units began to run low on ammunition and fuel. The captured rations were quickly eaten. Hunger returned, sharper than before. But the memory of that night lingered. The image of a German officer holding up a pack of gum and asking in disbelief, "They send this to the front lines?" stayed with everyone who had been there. It was more than a question. It was a statement about the power and reach of the enemy they faced. The war was no longer just about battles. It was about who could keep their soldiers fed and supplied, and who could not. The German soldiers sat around a small fire, their faces lit by the orange glow. Snow drifted down in the darkness, settling on their helmets and shoulders. The men passed around pieces of chocolate and shared sips of coffee brewed from captured American supplies. At first, there had been laughter, the simple joy of tasting something rich and sweet after weeks of thin soup and stale bread. But as the night wore on, the mood shifted. One soldier stared at the half-eaten chocolate bar in his hand. "Back home," he said quietly, "our families wait in line for bread. Some nights they go to bed hungry." He looked at the others, his voice tight. "And here, their soldiers chew candy." The words hung in the cold air. A few men nodded, saying nothing. The bitterness was clear. Another soldier, younger and less restrained, slammed his fist against a crate. "Our leaders promised us victory. They told us the fatherland was strong. But we have nothing, not even proper food." Meanwhile, the Americans fight with full bellies. His anger grew as he spoke. "This is why we freeze in these woods while they sit by fires with coffee and sugar." The squad leader tried to calm him, but his own voice carried a trace of frustration. It is not just food. It is what the food means. They have factories that never stop. They have trains, trucks, ships, endless supplies. We are fighting an enemy with more than soldiers. We are fighting their industry. Silence followed. Each man was lost in his own thoughts. Some felt envy, imagining what it would be like to fight with such abundance. Others felt shame, thinking of families back home living on rations smaller than what they had just eaten. The captured gum and candy were no longer just luxuries. They were symbols of everything Germany lacked. Nearby, a group of American prisoners huddled under blankets. They watched their captors' reactions with mixed emotions. A young American private glanced at the Germans sipping coffee and chewing gum. To him, these were ordinary things. He had grown up with candy and chocolate, with sugar in his coffee every morning. Now he saw how strange and precious these items seemed to the enemy. The private felt a flicker of pride. These supplies were proof of the strength of his country. But that pride was mixed with fear. He wondered what the Germans would do now that they understood how well the Americans were supported. Would it make them fight harder out of desperation? Or would it break their spirit, knowing they could never match such resources? An older American sergeant sat beside him, his face unreadable. He whispered, "Don't say a word to them. Just watch." The sergeant's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his unease. He had seen battles won and lost, but he knew that sometimes small details carried great weight. A pack of gum or a piece of chocolate could reveal more about the war than a map or a strategy report. Later, as the prisoners were moved to another location, they passed a group of German civilians gathered near a ruined farmhouse. Women and children stood in the cold, their faces pale and thin. They watched as German soldiers carried crates of American rations past them. The civilians whispered to one another, eyes wide at the sight of the colorful packages. A little boy tugged at his mother's coat and pointed at a bar of chocolate. She shushed him, her expression a mix of longing and fear. The soldiers did not stop to share. The food was meant for the front line, not the villages. The civilians understood, but the sight deepened their resentment. They had been told to endure hardship for the sake of victory. Now they saw that the enemy gave their soldiers luxuries their own families could only dream of. In towns recently liberated by American forces, the contrast was even starker. When U.S. troops entered, they often shared their rations with local people. Children tasted chewing gum for the first time, blowing bubbles and laughing. Women received tins of meat and sugar, gifts that seemed like miracles after years of scarcity. To these civilians, the arrival of American food was more than kindness. It was a sign that life might return to normal. It showed them that the war was shifting, that Germany's grip was weakening. Some wept as they held their first piece of chocolate in years. Others were silent, too overwhelmed to speak. Back in the forests and villages where the battle raged, German soldiers marched on. Some carried captured rations in their packs, saving them for moments of exhaustion. Others refused to touch the American food, feeling that eating it was a betrayal of their cause. As the days passed, hunger gnawed at everyone. German units that had once been disciplined began to splinter. Men argued over the smallest scraps. Some deserted, slipping into the night in search of food. Others fought bitterly to hold their positions, fueled by anger and desperation. Among the Americans, the captured soldiers spoke quietly about what they had seen. They understood that the gum and candy were more than just rations. They were symbols of a vast, unseen struggle. For every box of food sent to the front, there were countless workers in factories, farmers in fields, and sailors on supply ships. The Americans were part of a machine that stretched across oceans. The Germans understood this too, though they rarely spoke of it aloud. When a soldier unwrapped a piece of gum, he was reminded of his own family's empty table. When he chewed it, the taste was sharp with more than sugar. It carried envy, anger, and the knowledge that the war was slipping beyond their reach. The civilians in the countryside saw these truths in their own way. They compared the ragged German supply carts with the neat, colorful packages carried by the Americans. They saw who could provide and who could not. In the end, even the smallest things, A stick of gum, a square of chocolate, told the story of a world at war. Snow covered the roads and fields, turning the Ardennes into a frozen battlefield. German trucks moved slowly, their engines straining. Some carried wounded men. Others carried the last few crates of ammunition and fuel. The winter offensive that had started with sudden force was now faltering. German soldiers marched with their heads low, hungry and exhausted. They had captured supplies from American positions early in the battle, but those stores were gone. Hunger gnawed at them once again. In the towns behind the front, German commanders met in dimly lit rooms, maps spread across wooden tables. Reports came in from every sector. Fuel shortages were crippling tank units. Ammunition was running low. Entire regiments were running on half rations or less. Commanders asked for reinforcements and new supplies, but the answers were always the same. There was nothing left to send. Allied bombers had destroyed rail lines and bridges. Factories could not replace the losses. Field officers talked quietly about what their men had seen when they captured American camps. They spoke of crates filled with coffee, gum, chocolate, cigarettes, and canned meat. To some, it seemed like an insult. To others, it was a terrifying sign of what they faced. If the enemy could afford to send luxuries to the front line, then their reserves must be endless. One officer put it plainly, "We fight on scraps. They fight on plenty." This realization spread among the troops. At first, there had been excitement when they seized the American rations. The food tasted like a dream compared to their own meager supplies. But as the days passed, the mood changed. Soldiers began to understand what it meant. For every piece of gum in a captured box, there were thousands more waiting behind it. For every crate of coffee, entire warehouses stood full. The Americans were not just well supplied. They were supplied beyond measure. The psychological weight of this was heavy. German troops began to doubt the chances of victory. Even the most loyal among them could see the difference. They marched past empty supply wagons and burned-out trucks, knowing that the enemy never seemed to run out of anything. American soldiers, on the other hand, drew strength from their steady flow of rations. After long marches and hard fighting, they opened their K-rations and found familiar things. A bar of chocolate reminded them of home. A cup of coffee warmed them against the cold. These comforts were small, but they gave them a sense of normal life even in the middle of battle. They also built trust in their own system. A soldier who never went hungry believed that his army would take care of him. Commanders understood this effect. They pushed to keep supply lines open, even when it meant risking convoys under enemy fire. The sight of well-fed soldiers lifting hot coffee to their lips was as important as any weapon. It meant morale stayed high. It meant men would keep fighting when the weather and the enemy tried to break them. The difference in logistics was as decisive as any tank or gun. While German units stalled for lack of fuel and food, American forces grew stronger. Fresh troops arrived with full packs and steady support. Trucks carried supplies day and night. Engineers built new roads and bridges to keep the flow moving forward. Even in the thick forests and deep snow, the Americans kept their armies fed and armed. In some captured villages, German civilians saw the contrast with their own eyes. They watched American soldiers unload neat, colorful boxes of food and equipment. The boxes seemed endless, a river of goods flowing in from somewhere far away. German troops, by comparison, arrived with little to give. Civilians began to whisper that the war could not be won. If the enemy had such abundance, what hope was left? The Battle of the Bulge showed the German high command what they already feared. Their armies were running on borrowed time. The factories that had once powered their war machine were failing. Oil fields were lost. Railways were broken. Even when troops fought bravely, they were betrayed by an empty supply chain. Among the German soldiers at the front, this truth was felt deeply. A man who had once dreamed of victory now thought only of survival. He chewed a piece of captured gum and wondered how many more the enemy had waiting. It seemed like there was no end to it. That single piece of gum told him more than any official report. It said that his side was running out of everything, while the Americans would never run out of anything. As the offensive collapsed, German units began to retreat. They left behind broken vehicles and burned supplies. The Americans advanced, their trucks rolling steadily behind the front lines. Soldiers marched forward with coffee in their cups and chocolate in their packs. Each small comfort was proof of the strength behind them. For the Germans, the lesson was bitter. The sight of gum and candy in enemy rations was no longer just strange or surprising. It had become a symbol of defeat. It showed that the war was not just being fought on the battlefield. It was being fought in factories, on railroads, and across oceans. In that larger fight, Germany had already lost. The difference was clear in every camp and every captured crate. American soldiers fought with steady support, their morale reinforced by the simple things in their packs. German soldiers fought on empty stomachs, their morale weakened by hunger and doubt. The collapse of their supply lines was not sudden. It happened step by step, meal by meal, until there was nothing left to give. In the end, the discovery of those rations told the story of the entire campaign. It was proof of a gap too wide to bridge. A pack of gum in a snowy forest became a warning of the future. For the Germans, it was a sign that the war they were fighting could no longer be won. The war ended in ruins and silence. Germany lay broken, its cities bombed, its armies scattered. The snow melted from the battlefields, revealing rusted weapons and torn uniforms. The soldiers who had fought in the Ardennes returned to their homes or to prison camps. Among the memories they carried were stories of the things they had seen during those last desperate months. One story spread more than others. It was told by men who had fought at the front and by those who had been captured. It was about the American rations. Soldiers spoke of crates filled with meat, sugar, coffee, chocolate, and chewing gum. They described the wax boxes, the neat packaging, and the strange luxury of small items like candy bars and cigarettes. For many Germans, the memory of that discovery stayed with them long after the fighting stopped. It became a symbol of what they had faced in those final days. The meaning of those rations went beyond hunger. They represented a larger truth. Germany had been fighting a war it could no longer sustain. Its soldiers had marched on empty stomachs while their enemy had plenty. Even the smallest item in an American pack told the story of an entire nation's resources. A stick of gum or a square of chocolate showed how far American industry reached. It showed that the Allies were not just stronger in numbers but also in supply. In towns across Europe, civilians also remembered these rations. When the American forces liberated villages and cities, they often shared their food with the local people. Children tasted gum for the first time, their eyes wide with surprise at its sweetness. Some laughed as they learned to blow bubbles. Adults received tins of meat and bags of sugar, gifts that felt like miracles after years of scarcity and rationing under German occupation. For many Europeans, these moments were deeply emotional. The food represented more than survival. It was a sign of hope and freedom. Even decades later, people would tell their children and grandchildren about the first time they tasted American chocolate or chewing gum. These simple things became symbols of liberation. In the years after the war, chewing gum and candy became closely linked to American culture in Europe. They were sold in stores and carried by returning soldiers. The sight of a gum wrapper or a chocolate bar brought back memories of the war's end. These items became part of the story of how the Allies had brought not only military victory but also a glimpse of abundance to a continent that had known only hunger and fear. The military also learned lessons from this experience. Commanders on both sides studied the role of logistics in the war. They saw how vital it was to keep soldiers well-fed and supplied. The Americans had proven that nutrition and morale were as important as weapons and tactics. A soldier who ate well fought better, marched farther, and recovered faster from wounds and fatigue. Modern armies took these lessons seriously. After the war, militaries around the world redesigned their rations. They considered not just calories but also taste, variety, and convenience. The goal was to create food that met physical needs and boosted morale. Today, military planners still see rations as a key part of combat readiness. The packages may look different, but the idea remains the same. A well-fed soldier is a more effective soldier. The story of the captured rations also became part of historical reflection. Historians wrote about how small details could reveal the larger shape of the war. A simple piece of gum told as much about the conflict as a map or a battle report. It showed how the Allies used their industrial power to project strength across oceans and continents. It reminded readers that wars are won not only by strategy and bravery but also by factories, farms, and supply chains. Veterans from both sides often spoke about these moments. American soldiers remembered sharing their rations with civilians and prisoners. Some recalled the surprise on German faces when they first saw the contents of a K-ration. German veterans spoke of their disbelief and envy. They remembered how it felt to chew gum for the first time while knowing their own families at home were hungry. These memories were personal, but they also carried the weight of history. In post-war Europe, as countries rebuilt, the contrast between scarcity and abundance slowly faded. Trade returned, factories reopened, and food became more plentiful. Yet the image of the American ration box remained vivid. It was a reminder of a time when the balance of power had been so unequal. It also became part of a larger story about the modern world, where logistics and production could decide the fate of nations. Even in later conflicts, soldiers and civilians recalled the lessons of World War II. Military historians pointed to the Battle of the Bulge as an example of how supply lines could shape a campaign. They studied how German forces had stalled when their fuel and food ran out, while American units had advanced steadily thanks to their constant flow of supplies. The small items in those boxes, coffee, sugar, candy, gum, came to represent more than just food. They were pieces of a vast system that reached from American farms and factories to the front lines of Europe. Each item carried with it the weight of an entire nation's effort. For the men who fought, these memories never faded. A German soldier might sit in a quiet room years later, unwrap a piece of chocolate, and remember the cold forests and the captured rations. An American veteran might see a stick of gum and recall sharing it with a child in a ruined village. These moments connected the past to the present in ways that were both simple and profound. The story of the gum and candy was passed down through families, books, and films. It became part of the collective memory of the war. It showed how even the smallest details could capture the scale of a global conflict. A pack of gum in a soldier's pocket was not just a snack. It was a symbol of the industrial power that had shaped the outcome of the war and the world that came after it.